The morning of my 70th birthday arrived like any other day, silent, still, and far too quiet for my liking. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound more pronounced in the emptiness of my home. The sun had already begun to rise, casting soft golden light through the curtains, but it felt more like an ordinary Wednesday than the milestone day I had once imagined. I shuffled into the kitchen, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, reminding me that I wasn't as spry as I used to be. The scent of fresh coffee was absent from the air, and the kitchen, which used to be the heart of our home, now felt like a cold, forgotten corner of the world. The table was set for one, just like it had been for many years now. A solitary birthday card sat on the table in front of me, a cheerful image of balloons and confetti adorning the front. But inside there was nothing. No warm message, no signature, just an empty space where a few kind words from my children should have been. I ran my fingers over the card, tracing the creases where the edges had bent over the years. They didn't call, they didn't visit. My son David and my daughter Lily had both promised me they'd be here today. "We'll come for your birthday, Mom. We'll make sure it's special," they had promised me just a few weeks ago. But as the hours ticked by, it became clear. I had been forgotten. I forced myself to sit down at the table. The warm mug of coffee that sat untouched for too long now felt like a cruel reminder of the emptiness I had felt creeping in for years. I had always expected this day would be different, that they would at least call, at least remember. A text message would have sufficed, something, anything. But nothing. The phone sat silently on the counter, no pings or beeps from the kids. My heart tightened as I stared at it, wondering if I would ever hear from them again. The breakfast I made for myself was no different from the one I had every morning. The scrambled eggs were rubbery, the toast slightly burnt, and the orange juice, while refreshing, couldn't mask the bitterness in the air. I chewed slowly, each bite feeling like a chore, but I didn't have the energy to complain. The day ahead seemed so long already, and it hadn't even really started. I glanced out the window, watching the neighbors' children running down the street, their laughter filling the air. I could almost hear the echoes of my own children's laughter in this very street years ago, the same laughter that had once filled this house during birthdays and holidays. But now it was just the sound of silence. I couldn't help but wonder where it all went wrong. Where had they gone? Why was it that the children I had cared for, nurtured, and loved had become so distant? The years hadn't always been easy, but I had always given my best, always tried to be there when they needed me. But somehow, somewhere along the way, they had moved on and I had been left behind. I pushed the empty plate away, the feeling of defeat sinking deep within me. No point in pretending it didn't matter. I had spent the better part of my life trying to make everyone happy. I had built their lives, shaped their futures, and made countless sacrifices. But now, in my 70th year, I had no one to share it with. No one to celebrate it with. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall was louder now, echoing in the otherwise silent room. Tick-tock. Time moved on and I felt stuck, frozen in this moment, in this life I had built alone. I glanced at the phone again, willing it to ring, but it remained silent. Not even a message. Perhaps they had forgotten, perhaps they were too busy with their own lives. I didn't know anymore. The years of waiting for a call, a visit, had made it all feel like a dream. I had given them everything, but it had never seemed enough. I sat there for what felt like an eternity. There was no point in pretending anymore. No point in keeping hope alive. They were not coming. And I once again was left behind. Forgotten, I leaned back in the chair that had once been a warm gathering spot for family meals, and let my mind drift backward in time. It wasn't hard to remember the past. My memories of raising David and Lily were still vivid, as if I could reach out and touch them. Those days had been filled with laughter, noise, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. Every birthday, every holiday, every small moment in between had been for them. I was just 25 when I had David, and I remember the overwhelming rush of love and fear that gripped me the moment I held him in my arms. A tiny, helpless creature, yet I knew, with certainty, that he would be the center of my world. A few years later, Lily came into our lives, and the joy of motherhood grew even greater. The days of diapers and midnight feedings, of scraped knees and soccer games, those years shaped me into the woman I had become. I had always been there for them, through every birthday, every graduation, every scraped knee, and every broken heart. I had worked tirelessly to provide for them. Their father had been absent for most of their childhood, and so it had been my responsibility to be both mother and father. And I did it with pride. I worked 2 jobs to keep the house running. In the early mornings, I'd be out the door by 6 a.m., making sure the kids had breakfast, lunches packed, and that everything was in order before I left for work. Then, after long hours at the office, I'd rush home to make dinner, help with homework, and still find time to sit with them, listening to their hopes, dreams, and fears. I made sure they knew they were loved. No matter how tired I was, no matter how much I had sacrificed, I made sure they felt safe in my arms. I remember the birthdays, those days when I would spend weeks planning the perfect celebration for them. The balloons, the cake, the decorations, the games. I always wanted them to feel special. After all, the world had a way of making them feel invisible sometimes, so I made sure they knew that in our home, they were seen, they were everything. David's 8th birthday stands out. He had begged for a new bike, but I couldn't afford it. That year I worked overtime for months just to save enough money to buy him that shiny red bike. When I handed it to him, his face lit up with pure joy. The kind of joy that made all those sleepless nights and hard days worth it. It didn't matter that I had to go without something for myself. I was willing to give up anything for them. Lily had always been different, where David had been the outgoing, adventurous one. Lily was quieter, more sensitive. I remember spending hours on weekends just listening to her talk about her friends, her hopes for the future, and her love for art. I encouraged her, told her she could be anything she wanted, a doctor, a teacher, a painter, whatever her heart desired. But there was a longing in her eyes I didn't understand at the time. A longing that, as the years passed, seemed to deepen. As they grew older, I felt the distance between us begin to grow. It wasn't something I noticed immediately. At first, it was just the occasional late-night study session or sports practice that kept them occupied. Then it was weekends away with friends. The calls became fewer, the visits less frequent. But I told myself it was just part of growing up, that they had their own lives now, and that was fine. After all, I had done my job. I had given them everything I had. But slowly, without realizing it, I became a stranger in their lives. There were signs, of course. I remember the day David graduated from college. He had been distant leading up to it, distracted and preoccupied with something I couldn't quite place. I had wanted so badly for him to see me, to know how proud I was, but when he hugged me goodbye, the hug felt colder than I expected. It wasn't just the physical distance between us, it was emotional. Lily, too. Her wedding day should have been the happiest day of my life, but instead it was like I was an outsider looking in. I stood at the back of the room, watching her marry the man she had chosen, and all I could think about was how far she had drifted. The little girl who had once needed me for everything now had a life of her own, a world I was no longer a part of. I tried to keep in touch. I called, I sent letters, I invited them for visits, but the calls stopped coming. The letters remained unanswered, and the invitations were met with empty promises. "We'll come visit soon, Mom," they'd say. "We've just been busy," but the months turned into years, and soon, those empty promises became my reality. The years slipped by quietly. There were birthdays, of course, mine and theirs, but they no longer held the significance they once did. The holidays, once filled with laughter and love, became quieter. The phone calls on Christmas and Thanksgiving were no longer frequent. I was still here, still waiting, but no one seemed to notice. I didn't want to burden them with my loneliness, but it was impossible not to feel it. The house had grown too big, the walls too empty. The photos on the walls of birthdays and family vacations had faded with time, their once vibrant colors becoming pale memories. And now, as I sat here alone on my 70th birthday, I realized just how far I had fallen from the people I had once held so close. I had been everything to them once, their protector, their guide, their mother. But now, I was just another forgotten memory, gathering dust. The clock ticked on, as it always did. Every second that passed seemed to drag longer than the last. By now the morning sun had crept higher, casting long shadows across the living room floor, but inside, it felt like the hours were standing still. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the background was the only sound that filled the silence. I stared at the phone again, my hand hovering over it, hesitating to pick it up. I didn't want to seem desperate, but the yearning to hear their voices was overwhelming. I picked it up anyway. The screen blinked to life, and I searched for their names in my contacts, but my finger lingered over the screen. As the reality set in, they wouldn't answer. Not today, not any day, it seemed. The air in the house had changed. The quiet was no longer a comfort, but a burden. The warmth of the sun outside only made the emptiness inside feel colder. The walls of the house, once filled with the sounds of children playing, now felt like a tomb, suffocating in its silence. I stood up from the table, the familiar ache in my knees, reminding me of my age. It had always been there, a dull, persistent throb that I had learned to ignore over the years. But today it felt like a weight I couldn't carry anymore. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtains. The street was empty, save for a few cars passing by. I watched them, the people I didn't know, as they hurried about their business. They had families, loved ones, purpose. I once had that too, a family to share moments with, to laugh and celebrate with. But now I was left to watch the world pass by from behind glass, separated from everything that once mattered to me. The phone buzzed in my hand, and for a split second, I thought it might be them. My heart raced as I looked at the screen, but it was just a reminder, the one that pops up every year. Don't forget to wish Mom a happy birthday. A text from the calendar app, timed to remind me of the things I would have liked to forget. I closed the phone with a quiet sigh, the sting of being forgotten sinking deeper into my chest. I had tried not to let it get to me, but the truth was undeniable. My children had moved on, and I had been left behind, an afterthought in a life they no longer needed me to be a part of. I sat back down at the table, my empty coffee mug in front of me. There was no reason to fill it, no reason to eat anything. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. What was I doing here, alone? Why had everything changed? The loneliness was suffocating, and yet there was an odd stillness that settled in, almost as if I had come to accept the harsh truth. I had spent my whole life waiting for others to notice me, to see the sacrifices I made, to see the love I gave. But no one was looking. They were all too busy with their own lives. I tried to distract myself, flipping through the old photo albums on the shelf beside me. There were pictures of David and Lily when they were young, birthdays, holidays, first days of school, smiling faces, happy moments, frozen in time. I paused on a photo of them sitting on the couch, their little faces beaming at the camera, their eyes full of joy and love. I could almost hear their laughter again, the sound that used to fill the house, that used to fill me. But that laughter was gone now, replaced by the hollow echo of silence. I tried to hold back the tears, but it was impossible. I wiped them away quickly, but they kept coming. I hadn't cried in years, not since they were young, not since I had taught myself to keep my emotions in check. But today, on my 70th birthday, it felt like the dam had broken. The doorbell rang, a sharp sound that cut through the stillness. I startled, my heart leaping in my chest, wondering if it was them, if perhaps they had come after all, if they had remembered. But when I opened the door, it wasn't David it was a delivery driver, holding a package in his hands. "Delivery for Mrs. Moore," he said, glancing at his clipboard. I blinked in surprise, unsure who would be sending me something. I took the package from him, muttering a soft thank you. The driver smiled politely, and with a final nod, turned to leave. The door closed behind him, and I stood in the hallway, staring at the brown box in my hands. It was a small box, wrapped simply in brown paper, with no return address. I shook it gently,
hearing the faint rattle of something inside. My curiosity piqued. I tore open the packaging, revealing a plain white envelope tucked inside. It was addressed to me, in handwriting I didn't recognize. I held it in my hands for a long moment, examining the envelope, wondering who could have sent it. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. It looked too neat to be a form letter, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was from one of my children. But as I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the contents, my heart stopped. The letter inside was official looking, printed on heavy paper. It was brief, the words written clearly, but the message struck me like a bolt of lightning. Dear Mrs. Moore, we regret to inform you that you are the beneficiary of the will of your late sister, Emily Moore. She passed away earlier this year and requested that this be delivered to you personally. You are entitled to the estate and assets that have been in her name. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the words. My sister? I hadn't heard from Emily in years. She had moved away, and over time, we had grown distant. I couldn't remember the last time we spoke, yet here was a letter, revealing that I was the beneficiary of her will. I sat down on the couch, the letter still clutched in my hands. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Why hadn't Emily contacted me? Why had she kept this a secret? Why had she chosen to leave everything to me after all this time? But then, another thought crossed my mind. This wasn't just a letter about an inheritance. This was something more. This was a chance for something new, something unexpected. Maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point I had been waiting for. Section 3 sets the emotional stage for the protagonist's discovery of the unexpected letter. It portrays the deep loneliness of the protagonist's 70th birthday, followed by the shock and curiosity of receiving a mysterious letter that hints at a hidden past and potential new beginnings. Section 4. Will, a life-changing revelation. I sat there, the envelope trembling slightly, and my hand struggling to make sense of what I had just read. The words on the paper didn't seem to match up with the life I had known. Emily, my sister, she had passed away, and yet here I was, learning of her will, of an inheritance I had never imagined. The letter was short, but its implications were vague. I had been named the beneficiary of Emily's estate. It was hard to wrap my head around it. Emily had been out of my life for years, a stranger in many ways, but now she was making me the focal point of her legacy. I reread the letter, my heart pounding faster with each line. It mentioned her estate, her asset, and that a meeting was scheduled to take place in a few days at her lawyer's office to discuss the details. I didn't know what to feel. A part of me was confused, another part, surprisingly, relieved. After all these years of silence between us, she had perhaps there was more to our relationship than I realized. I glanced around the house, the walls, now feeling colder than before. The place where I had spent the last years of my was no longer just a home. It was a place that might soon hold something far greater than its walls had ever contained. I tried to make sense of it. Emily had always been the more distant one. She had moved away years ago, and in the years that followed, I had heard little. We had both been so wrapped up in our own lives, our own families, that the connection we once had with her. Emily is the free spirit, the one who didn't tie herself down. While I had stayed close to home, to the children she had gone off on her, living a life of independence and distance. But now, in the wake of her death, she had left me something that I could never have anticipated. It wasn't just money or property. Though the lore mentioned those things, it was a piece of her life she had won. A piece I wasn't sure, not after all these years of neglecting our bond. 1 I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my fingers still clutching the loop. I poured myself a glass of water, my reflection in the glass staring back at me, older and more worn than I remember. But there was something different in today's spring that hadn't been there before. It was a spark, a flicker of possibility. I had been forgotten. Left alone on my birthday by the children I had raised. And now a forgotten one whom I had almost lost hope of ever hearing from again, had left me a legacy. The implications were overwhelming. The letter spoke of Emily's estate, her property, and her assets, but it didn't go into deep. It was as if she had wanted to make sure I received the news first, to give me the opportunity to decide how to move forward. I was about to head back to the living room when my phone rang. The sudden noise making me jump. I glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be another missed call from one of my children, though pardon. But when I picked it up, it wasn't David or Lily. It was a voice I didn't recognize, smooth and professional, with a slight formality to it.
Mrs. Moore, the voice asked. This is Marcus Whitfield from Whitfield and Finch, attorneys at law. I'm calling regarding the will of your late sister, Emily Moore. We have scheduled a meeting for you at our office to go over the details of her estate. Does tomorrow at 10 a.m. work for you? The words hung in the air and I could feel the weight of them, the sudden reality settling in. Yes, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. works. My hand shook as I held the phone to my ear, and I could hear the soft clink of my glass against the countertop as it slipped from my grip, falling into the sink with a dull thud. Great, Marcus Whitfield said. I'll send over the confirmation email. Please bring any documents you might need. We look forward to seeing you then. The call ended, and I was left in stunned silence. I didn't know what to expect from this meeting. I didn't know what Emily had left behind, or why she had chosen me to inherit her estate after all these years. But one thing was certain, this was going to change everything. I had been living a life of quiet resignation, making peace with the idea that my family had forgotten me, but now I was about to find out that not everyone had. Section 5. The decision to forgive or not. The following day came quickly, the minutes ticking by in a blur of anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something monumental, something that could change the course of my life. I tried to focus on the task at hand, preparing for the meeting, gathering my thoughts, but my mind kept drifting back to the letter, to the shock of Emily's death, and to the question that now consumed me. Why me? I stood in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the collar of my coat, staring at the reflection that was starting to feel more foreign with each passing day. My hair was graying, my face etched with the years I had spent raising children, working, loving, and waiting, and yet, here I was, looking at a future that seemed to stretch before me, a future I had never. I sighed deeply, running my fingers through my thinning hair. How had it all come to this? How had I ended up alone on my 70th birthday, forgotten by my own children, only to receive a letter from a sister I hadn't seen in years? I still couldn't make sense of it. The truth was, I had spent so much of my life putting others first, my children, my family, my work. I had always believed that love and sacrifice would be reciprocated, but as the years passed, I realized that sometimes, the ones you love most can turn away without warning. And now here I was, left to face a new reality, one where forgiveness and reconciliation were not just a matter of healing old wounds, but of determining my worth. I sat down on the couch and held the letter in my hands once again. I had reread it dozens of times, each time hoping for some deeper understanding, some hidden meaning I hadn't yet unlocked. But the words remained the same. Emily had left everything to me. But why? She had always been the more independent one, the one who didn't look back. Why, after all these years of silence, had she chosen to leave me her estate? What did she expect from me? It was easy to be angry, to feel betrayed, to resent her for leaving me in the dark for so long. But then there was the part of me that couldn't help but feel a glimmer of something else, something softer, something that told me I wasn't entirely alone. Maybe Emily had been trying to make up for the years of separation. Maybe in her own way she had been reaching out, even after her death. I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my mind. I wondered what Emily had seen in me, what part of me had remained significant enough for her to leave behind this legacy. She knew I was alone. She knew I had lost touch with my children.
But she had never been one for sentimental gestures. She was pragmatic, logical, and guarded. So why, after all this time, would she choose to include me in her will? The thought of accepting her inheritance made me uneasy. There was so much more to it than just money or property. It was an emotional decision, one that carried the weight of years of silence, of missed opportunities, and of painful regrets. To accept it meant confronting all the ways I had been abandoned by my children, by Emily, by the life I thought I was building. And yet, another part of me felt that I had been given a second chance. A chance to break free from the quiet isolation that had defined my last years. To accept Emily's was to step into a new life, one where I could start over. If I was willing to face my fears, my resentments, and the truth about why I had been forgotten in the first place, I stood up, my heart racing. The decision weighed heavily on me. But there was something inside me that refused to stay stuck in the past, something that told me I could still make a choice. I didn't have to accept the inheritance out of obligation. I could accept, on my own terms, as a way to move forward, to rebuild the relationships that mattered, and to heal the wounds that had been left un. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was the lawyer's office again, confirming the time for our meeting later that morning. My stomach twisted with anxiety, but I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady but quiet. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future would hold or how this decision would change things. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my past. I couldn't keep waiting for the phone calls that would never come, for the relationships that had faded. It was time to face the future, even if it meant walking into the unknown. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the door, my heart pounding with each step. I wasn't sure what the meeting would bring, but whatever it was, I knew it was the beginning of something new, a new chapter. A chance to heal, a chance to be seen, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to see myself.
The following days after my meeting with the lawyer were filled with a strange sense of urgency, but also a sense of relief. The discovery of Emily's will had not only changed the course of my future, but had opened up a door I had long ago sealed shut, the door to my relationships, particularly with my children. For years, I had buried the hurt of being forgotten, of being left behind. But now, with this unexpected inheritance and the chance to begin again, I knew it was time to confront the silence that had grown between us. I picked up the phone several times, but my hand always hovered above the dial. David and Lily had both distanced themselves from me for so long, and now, with everything that had just happened, I didn't know how to begin. What would I say? How would I even start to rebuild the trust and connection we once had? But there was a part of me, a part that had been dormant for so long, that knew this was the only chance I had. I couldn't wait for them to come to me. I had to take the first step. The phone felt heavier than ever as I scrolled through my contacts, finally settling on David's name. His number hadn't changed, though I had not heard from him in months. The thought of his voice brought both comfort and anxiety. I pressed call before I could change my mind. "Mom," David's voice came through the phone, thick with surprise. He clearly hadn't been expecting to hear from me. "David, it's me," I said, my voice steady but wavering with emotion. "I want to talk. Can you come by? We need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he might decline. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Then finally, "Sure, Mom, I'll come by later." That was all he said, but it was enough. My heart lifted slightly. The first step had been taken. David's arrival that afternoon felt like a delicate moment in time, a pivotal point that would either move us toward healing or push us further apart. I stood up when he walked in, unsure of what the right words were. So many years of estrangement, of hurt, of longing to reconnect. How could I possibly express all of it in one conversation? He stood at the door for a moment, hesitant, and then slowly walked toward the couch, sitting across from me. There was a familiar discomfort in the air between us, but also something new, a possibility. Mom, he began, his voice quieter than usual. I know I've been distant, and I'm sorry. I've been caught up in everything and I should have reached out. I didn't know how to fix things. His words were simple, but they struck me in ways I hadn't expected. I had spent so many years waiting for him to come to me, to apologize, to understand the hurt that I had carried. But now here he was, doing exactly that, admitting his fault, reaching out. I've missed you, David, I said, the tears that had been building up threatening to spill over. I know I haven't been perfect either, but I want to try. I want us to try. He looked at me, his face softening, and for the first time in years I felt like I was seeing my son again. The son who had once needed me, the son who had once laughed with me, played with me, told me everything. I don't know where to start, Mom, but I want to start somewhere. I'm sorry it took me so long. The relief I felt in that moment wasn't sudden, nor was it total, but it was enough. Enough to make me believe that this wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of something that could heal the fractures between us. After David left that day, I sat in silence for a while, letting his words settle in. He had come, he had listened, he had apologized. But more than that, he had shown me that he was willing to meet me halfway, and that in itself was a victory. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful moments. Phone calls, texts, short visits. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were building something again, piece by piece. And that was enough to give me hope. As time passed, I realized that the inheritance wasn't just about the material wealth. It was about the opportunity to rebuild not just my own life, but the relationships that had been neglected. It was about finding myself again, something I had lost in the years of being a mother, a wife, a caretaker. I had given so much of myself that I didn't know who I was anymore. But now, with this unexpected turn in my life, I had the chance to rediscover who I could be, without the weight of the past holding me down. The house, the estate, the properties, they all became symbols of a new beginning. They weren't just material possessions. They were the stepping stones toward a life I had once imagined. A life where I could finally take control, finally make the decisions that were mine to make. And as I stood in the living room one evening, looking out at the yard, I realized that I wasn't just rebuilding my relationships. I was rebuilding my own sense of self. I was no longer just a mother who had been abandoned. I was a woman with a future I was beginning to shape on my own terms. David had apologized, and in time I would reach out to Lily. The wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but this was the beginning. We had to start somewhere. And just like that, with each step, I began to believe that the future could be different, that it could be better. The days that followed were both a blur and a revelation. I spent hours poring over the documents Marcus Whitfield had given me, navigating the intricacies of the estate that Emily had left behind. There were meetings with accountants, visits to the properties, and phone calls with agents, all of which seemed to carry a weight I had never known. But through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking a path I hadn't expected to take. A path that was slowly but surely leading me towards something new. I had always thought that my life was winding down, that I would simply age into the quiet years of solitude, watching the world move on without me. But now, with the inheritance and the chance to reconnect with my family, everything felt different. I wasn't done yet. There was still so much I could do, so much I could change. The most significant change, however, was the way I saw myself. For so long I had defined myself by what I gave to others. I had been a mother, a wife, a caretaker, but never truly myself. The weight of others' expectations had shaped my identity, and I had let it. But now, with a chance to reclaim my own future, I was learning to put myself first. I walked through the house one evening, looking at the photographs that had once been a source of pain, the smiling faces of David and Lily in their childhood, their school photos, their weddings, They all stared back at me, reminding me of the years that had passed, and the distance between us. But now, as I gazed at them, I didn't feel sorrow, I felt resolve. I was no longer the forgotten one. I was still here. I still had the chance to make things right. One of the first things I decided to do with the inheritance was invest in myself. I had always wanted to start a small business, something that was just mine. After years of taking care of everyone else, it felt like the right time to pursue my own passions. With the properties I inherited, I had the means to make it happen. I didn't have a clear vision at first. I just knew that I needed something to bring me joy, something that would give me purpose. After much thought, I settled on the idea of opening a small boutique. It would be a place where I could create a space that was entirely my own, a place where I could welcome others in, share the things I loved, and most importantly, feel like I was making a difference. I poured my energy into the project. I met with contractors to renovate one of the smaller properties, turning it into a charming boutique that would offer handmade goods, local art, and vintage finds. It wasn't the largest of businesses, but it was mine. Every decision, from the color of the walls to the display shelves, felt empowering. I was creating something that reflected who I was, not who I had been expected to be. As the boutique began to take shape, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living fully and purposefully. For the first time in a long time, I could see a future for myself that was bright and full of possibility. As my new venture took off, I also took steps toward mending my relationship with Lily. After David's visit and our heart-to-heart conversation, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The distance between Lily and me had always been more subtle than with David, but the emotional walls we had built over the years were just as strong. I wrote her a letter, a simple letter, but one that contained everything I had been holding back for so long. I told her that I missed her. I told her that I understood how much time had passed, and that I regretted letting our relationship drift. But most importantly, I told her that I was ready to try again, that I wanted to reconnect. It was a difficult letter to write, but it was even harder to send. The fear of rejection, of being brushed off once again, kept me awake some nights. But I knew that I had to take the chance. I couldn't let the years of silence continue. If there was even a glimmer of hope for reconciliation, I had to reach for it. A week later, I received her reply. The letter was short, but the words were enough. She acknowledged the time that had passed, and the hurt that had come with it. But she also wrote that she had been thinking about me too. She apologized for her own role in the distance, and expressed a desire to meet, to talk, to rebuild. It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was a start. We arranged to meet in a park the following weekend. The moment I saw her, sitting on the bench with her arms crossed, I felt a lump in my throat. She was different, of course, older, more guarded. But the resemblance to the young girl I once knew was still there. I approached her slowly, unsure of how to begin. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said quietly when I reached her. "I should have reached out sooner. I've missed you." The words I had waited so long to hear. "I've missed you too," I replied, my voice shaking with emotion. "I don't know what happened, but I'm willing to try." We talked for hours that day, walking through the park, sharing stories, laughing, and yes, even crying. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one. We both had so much to say, so much to make up for. But the foundation was there. We were starting again. As the weeks turned into months, I continued to work on my boutique. My relationships with David and Lily deepened, and I began to explore the possibilities the inheritance had given me. But more than that, I was learning to live for myself. I wasn't just surviving. I was embracing my second chance at life. The boutique became a symbol of that new chapter, a physical manifestation of my decision to take control of my future. It wasn't just a business. It was a place where I could pour my heart into something meaningful, something that mattered. And every time I walked through its doors, I felt proud, knowing that this was mine. I had created it. And as for my family,
It was clear that the road to healing would take time, but the journey had begun. I didn't know what the future held for me, for David, for Lily, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. I wasn't the forgotten one anymore. I wasn't the abandoned mother, or the lonely woman sitting by the window, waiting for a call that never came. I was a woman with a future, with dreams of my own, and with a family that was beginning to remember me. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all.